Well, hello, everybody. I hope the sessions have been good last couple of days. I think it's always fun to come to the APAICS conference no matter what, and the gala is even more fun. But I'm so excited to see all of you here, excited to be here today, and to actually, I know the panel is called Impact Investing, but I think we could probably also call it, how are we having social impact in different ways today, whether it's through business, whether it's through nonprofits, whether it's through the MBA, and really talking about how this all, what is happening in the world today, that it's not just government doing its thing and business doing its thing and nonprofits doing their thing, but it really is about how do we bring communities together to have the greatest impact in the communities that we can through the tools that we might have. So a finance firm might have an investing tool. The NBA might have the players who they could work with. There's so many different ways we could think about this, but this is, I think, what we hope this conversation is about. My name is Sonal Shah. I am the interim executive vice president at United Way Worldwide. There are 1,200 United Ways globally, and I work on sort of global impact as well as sort of thinking about how to advance the ability for the United Ways to have the greatest impact possible. So I run their operations globally. And in my previous lives, I started the Asian American Foundation last year and have worked in government, business, and the nonprofit sector, as well as academia. So I feel like I've covered all the sectors. But really, I think what brings me to why this conversation is so important and why it's so important at APAICS is the Asian American community, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community is in every sector. We don't always talk about all the sectors that we're in, but we're in every sector. And to really think about how do we use our skill sets, what we know, to have the greatest impact in our communities around us, and what does that leadership look like today? So I am super excited that we have two amazing speakers. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because, and then I'll add the glowing pieces because they won't do it themselves. But to my left is Audrey Choi. She is at Morgan Stanley and has been actually doing impact since I've known her in the Clinton administration, where she was, you were at I
was at the Office of the Vice President and also at Council of Economic Advisors.
Right. I remember you from Council of Economic Advisors, but she was at the Office of the Vice President. But amazingly, she's gone from working in government to working in business, and has already made that transition quite interestingly of how to think about impact almost 20 years ago. So we're talking about impact investing today, but she's been doing this long before it became cool and hip to do, and to be thinking about that. So I'm super excited that Audrey's here, and she's also just a friend, so it's always fun to have a conversation. Saumya is a new friend, and he is now working with the MBA on social impact, and he will talk a little bit more about what he's doing, but super excited that he's here. He's 2 months into the job, so we'll get to grill him, and then he can change his answers in 2 months. In 2 more months. But more importantly, I think it's so interesting to have him here and to really be talking about why the MBA cares about this and what does it mean to do social justice through the MBA. So with that, Audrey, I'm going to turn it over to you if you don't mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you've been doing, and then we can go into questions.
Sure.
And just let me just say, please be ready to ask questions. We want to keep this an interactive session. There's no reason for this to be me just asking questions. If you have questions, please do raise your hand.
Great. Thanks, Sonal. And it's super great to be here with everyone. So like Sonal, I've had a bunch of different careers. Actually, before being in government, I was also at the Wall Street Journal, and I was a foreign correspondent and bureau chief at the Wall Street Journal for about 7 years, and among other things, got to cover German reunification and its aftermath. So it was not at all expected, at least for me, by me, to end up in finance. But about more than 15 years ago, I did end up at Morgan Stanley, and ended up really, again, as Sonal said, I came into it with the perspective of having been a Wall Street Journal reporter, and I had seen both how much the decision making by the private sector really could matter and how that they could shape their destinies, but also how much the private sector was influenced by public policy. And so I had a real sense of sort of the interplay between public and private there. But then, having been in government, obviously also had that real sense of how incredibly important it can be what decisions are made by policy, how the playing field is going to either be leveled or tilted in favor of something that you want to be able to encourage more of. But I also, when I left government, so I left the Clinton administration at approximately 12:01 p.m. on January 20th of 2001, because as we all know, elections have consequences and voting matters. And when there is a change in power, if you serve at the pleasure of the president, that's when you change. And as I watched things afterwards, I really came to see that, yes, government is incredibly powerful. And if you're trying to drive social change and impact through special initiatives, executive orders, persuading people to come along with you, what I often call sort of stone soup. There's no better stone soup than the president in the Rose Garden saying, "Could y'all bring me some carrots, and I'd like some onions, and gosh, whoever brings the meat's gonna, that's great." But once the Rose Garden is gone, a lasting engine for change is going to be also having business have their own profit-seeking motives. So that's why I went into business. And when I got to Morgan Stanley, again, not with an impact-focused mandate, I started basically gumshoeing around and say, well, we do all these things. We touch all these markets. And so I ended up actually proposing back in 2008, which for those of you who can remember was the depth of the financial crisis, that despite the financial crisis, Morgan Stanley should actually plant a flag around impact, and that what we did in our business, not philanthropy, because we had no extra money, not marketing, but through our business, that we should drive impact. And that ultimately led to the last 15 years of my career, which was focusing on how do we harness the power of capital markets to protect the environment, strengthen communities, create opportunity while being profitable for the investor. So we can talk more about it, but over the last 15 years, I got the opportunity to be the first chief sustainability officer on Wall Street. I also, for 4 years, was simultaneously Morgan Stanley's chief marketing officer. And so really got to bring together how much people want brands that they work with or buy from to care about things, not as an advertisement, but really as part of their business. So that's kind of a bizarre, quick overview. But
We have so much to talk about. Saumya.
Hello. I don't love mics, but here we are. Hello, everybody. First of all, just thank you to everybody here for coming out and for APAICS for putting on this wonderful conference and to talk more about the AAPI community and all, as Sonal said, all the various sectors we are in and all the good work we are doing. It's awesome to see, especially as somebody who didn't have a lot of role models in government or social sciences, et cetera, as when I was younger, and to look around and see folks be a part of that is really, really exciting and really cool. But I'm no longer in government. I'm now in sports. So I'm at the NBA, and I'm actually at a place called the National Basketball Social Justice Coalition. And the Social Justice Coalition is a new 501c4 that is a joint venture between the NBA, players, the Players Association, coaches, the Coaches Association, teams, et cetera. And it's designed specifically to tackle inequality and racial justice and social justice. And it is designed to do so in a way that is long-lasting and can achieve change, through things that often are not associated with sports leagues or businesses. Things like, getting folks to be involved with their government and to come out in favor of legislation. The coalition has come out at the federal level in favor of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis VRAA, and the Equal Act as well. And then obviously also starting to look at state level legislation, local initiatives that the coalition can be involved in and support. And I think for me, I come from a background of government and advocacy. I've done healthcare advocacy. I've done democracy advocacy. And what's really interesting about the opportunity that the coalition has is, there is a large community and a large fan base that really cares about these issues and really cares about, you know, the ways in which their lives unfold and how they are able to live in the country. And at the same time, they're fans of the game of basketball. And the game of basketball is something that is and has been and historically can be something that connects various communities, various people, and it doesn't have, you know, a political tilt necessarily to the game. And so when you look out and you see what is the power of activism for an athlete. And I think, you know, athletes have always been activists. There is a long history of players in baseball with Jackie Robinson or in basketball with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? There's a long, Muhammad Ali, there's a long history of athletes taking very, very important stands. And this is really just the next evolution in that step of how do you take something that is very important and can be momentous and can be impactful, whether it's a statement or a stand, and say we're going to put institutional resources behind that in order to try to make change, in order to try to change legislation, have an impact at the state level, and build a, you know, better state, better community that actually seeks out justice and equality. And I think that's really, really interesting. And of course, like, clearly has a purpose for the NBA, because it is something that the league cares about. It is something that, you know, I obviously care about, something that the players care about, and at the end of the day, it's something that the fans care about. And I think that's really important to recognize and understand as we move forward.
Okay, first of all, I didn't even know it was a C4, so that's pretty cool. I would love to both of you, and I think both of you sort of alluded to it in your own introductions. There is sort of this question of why now, and sort of what has created, Audrey, in your, you know, from a finance community's perspective, why have social impact in a business? What's motivating Morgan Stanley to do something like this, and why were you able to convince them at the depth of a crisis to be able to think about this? And Saumya, to you, why, you know, one would think about like the fan base sort of comes for basketball. Why are players getting more actively engaged in social justice, and why are the owners thinking about this? I mean, in some ways, what was interesting is a coalition of people that have come together to build that. But why now, and why do your institutions, which are largely money-making institutions, think about doing social impact now? Audrey, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, thanks, Sonal. You know, I think interestingly, so when we started it in the crisis, so back in 2008 when I proposed it, I think it was a couple things. One is that, you know, the core values of the firm that are, you know, carved into the wall had things like do the right thing, give back, and you know, and I think that at that point people had really imagined that meant have integrity and do charity and do volunteer work. But the other values that were also on the wall were lead with exceptional ideas and put clients first. And so I basically went to our CEO and said, look, we can do all of these things together. It's not that we make the money over here by leading with exceptional ideas for clients and then we give it away to do right and give back. We can actually do it together. And frankly, it wouldn't have happened if, you know, the CEO at the time, John Mack, and our president at the time, James Gorman, who's now our CEO, didn't say, not exactly sure how you think you're going to do that, but sure, give it a try. So really ironically, amazingly, in the depths of the crisis, they said, don't spend too much money, you don't get too much headcount, but if you think there's a there, we'll give you just a tiny bit of rope to kind of explore it. The reasons that I thought that there would be an interesting proposition for business were a couple things. One was that I was just seeing the trend of so many more people, especially frankly young people coming out of college, who were deeply passionate about saying, I don't want to have this frankly schizophrenic way of living my life. right? That I spend most of my waking time over here doing work just to trade my life hours for money, and then spend this small amount of time over here giving it away or volunteering. And they wanted to have more holistic view. And I was saying, I'm convinced that, and we were saying that those were when you had the first studies coming out of elite graduate school students saying that they would prefer, this was a 1990, I don't know, it was like a whatever, early 2000 study that said that graduates would rather get $40,000, and granted, adjust for inflation and time, right? $40,000 doing a job that they were passionate about versus $100,000 doing a job that they didn't care about. And so you saw the beginnings of what is now, fast forward to today, 99% of millennials said they're interested in sustainable investing, meaning why would I invest my money in things that are contrary to the values that I care about? So I think why you've seen, so that was sort of the chink of an opening of like, there's a talent play is what I told people to get the best and the brightest. I do think there's a reputation play. You'll be seen as the company that does the right thing. And I think there actually are real commercial opportunities, whether it's clean tech or other things. But at the time, less than 10% of the market was there. So at the time, 1 out of every $11 had some sort of social mandate, and it was mostly things to avoid: guns, tobacco, alcohol, whatever the thing that your community wanted to avoid. Fast forward to today, it is now more than a $30 trillion market, more than 1 of every $3 being invested and professionally managed. And so I often joke that, along the way, you suddenly have, as they say, success has many fathers. So now that it's a $30 trillion market, people are like, wow, we've always believed this. This is great. But I do believe it really comes down to fundamentally two things. One is the supercomputers that you all have in your hands. Right, so like when Sonal and I were in the White House back in the, right, exactly, at pagers, but that amount of computing power that you have in your hand, and you probably, as many of you probably have 2 of them in your purse, right, that amount of computing power, the National Security Council would have had to regulate for that to cross a national border, right? But you now have all that transparency. So every consumer can know, like, scan, like, this coffee that I just bought was not shade grown, involved child labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're demanding accountability from the brands that they buy. So that's a huge government signal. I mean, a huge customer signal for companies that if you want to be profitable, your QR scan better show something good. Secondly, and this is probably the most powerful reason why things have just exploded so much, is that we finally are really seeing data, because we have enough data to measure, that surprise, surprise, far from impact and sustainability and social justice even being a cost of doing business or something that reduces profit, it actually can enhance returns and can reduce risk. And just to give you like one quick data point, when we did a study over 15 years of performance of 11,000 different investment strategies, and you compare the sustainable ones to the non-sustainable one, or the traditional ones that don't think about sustainability explicitly, the sustainable strategies over the past 15 years performed pretty much exactly the same as the traditional strategies, but with up to 20% lower downside volatility. Interestingly, though, in 2019, 2020, and 21, they actually significantly outperformed the traditional strategies, and they were also less volatile to the downside. The one asterisk I'll put, and then I'll stop, is that in 2022, with the war in Ukraine and turbulence in the energy markets, you're seeing a lot of turbulence in everything, including some of those returns. But at the end of the day, people are still now do believe, how can more information to help me make an investment decision be bad? In every other sphere of the world, we use all the information we can get, and your effect on the environment, your effect on social justice is all part of how your company will be regarded by your employees, by your customers, by your regulators, and ultimately by the market.
Saumya.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about the why now is, as I sort of hinted at in the top, is I don't think this is new for sports leagues or for athletes. And the NBA does have a long history of investing in the communities that teams are in these markets through a program like NBA Cares, through the NBA Foundation. The teams themselves have done a lot of work with their communities, with local nonprofits, with the United Way, and have, really understand that these teams, these players are a part of their community. The ownership, the league officials, they are all part of this one community. And so this is really just the next step and the next evolution in, I think, what has been a long-standing commitment to trying to achieve social good in a Chicago or a Detroit or a Miami. And there's definitely ways to achieve change through partnering with local nonprofits. Doing youth programs, have a long-standing youth basketball program, but there's also this additional piece to it of actually saying we're going to go ahead and talk to legislative officials and have a lobby day. And that part of it is new. And I think that the moment sort of necessitates it. As I said, these players are they are part and parcel with their community. They have to live, in these places. And so when you see unequal justice, or you see a treatment of the law not actually happening in the way it should be or is designed to, or happening, again, in an unequal manner, there are more direct ways, and I think more impactful ways to try to make that change. And through legislative advocacy is just one of them. And so it's not that it's necessarily a new thing in terms of trying to make a difference in these communities. But what is new is the legislative advocacy piece. And, it is a C4. It is the first such C4 of any American sports league. And it's a little bit of an experiment. I think it's an important experiment, and it's one that I think will work out. But it's one that I think, everybody is deeply understanding of why it actually contributes to the mission of the NBA, which is, to connect communities through the power of basketball, and to leverage change, and to create, an understanding and shared values through sport. And I think that's really what this is about.
Can I just throw one other thing also of why I think now, and what's fundamentally different about these past couple of years, is that I think that obviously we're still living with the pandemic. We're now in the fifth surge, at least in this part of the world. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is that people have finally understood how everything is connected, right? Sort of heading into the pandemic, I remember the first 2 weeks of shutdown, some of my colleagues were like, "Oh, Audrey, no one cares about sustainability anymore. All they care about is, COVID." And I was like, but that's all kind of connected, right? And when you think about what we've seen over the last 3 years in terms of the extraordinarily, first of all, climate disasters, right? Where you have people in Germany and the Netherlands dying of rain. You have people in Portland, Oregon dying of heat. And not to mention all the other, the billions of dollars of damage from all sorts of extreme events. And it really does read like the Book of Job from weather. You have those climate disasters. You have George Floyd and the huge social justice reckoning, at least here in the States, as well as many other things going on globally. Of course, there is an anti-API violence, and then you have COVID. What people have finally started to realize is that how these are all interconnected, right? And when you start talking about systemic racism, it's really about systemic social injustice. It's about systemic climate injustice, as well as health justice, right? And it's no accident, unfortunately, that the communities that we've seen suffer the most these past couple of years have been predominantly low-income communities of color who are in highly exposed areas with poor quality infrastructure that leads them to be more vulnerable to extreme climate events, that leads them to be more closely located to sources of pollution, which leads to more respiratory vulnerability to things like, say, COVID, and also just hotter temperatures. And where the role of business is intimately connected with that is there have been studies that look at the areas in the United States that have been traditionally denied access to credit, right? So, communities that were redlined. There was a legislation in 1977 that was trying to prevent specifically banks from redlining communities. So supposedly those communities now have much more equitable access. But you go back to those communities that were previously redlined. Today, those neighborhoods compared to affluent neighborhoods in the same meteorological zone can be up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in the summer, because they don't have water elements and parks and grass and trees and sidewalks. And so to me, that's just this incredible, visualization of the intersection of lack of access to finance, the issue of race and income leading to, literally climate and health dire consequences. So that, I think, has helped people.
Please.
So when you say investing sustainable strategies, what do you mean by sustainable? And with like what's included, and the question I'm trying to get at is, because and you say 99% of millennials care about sustainable investing, but there's so much divisiveness, and the more you kind of talk about the details, like the impact on low-income communities. Do all people generally care about the same things? Do they have the same values? But so how do you kind of tell the stories around that to make sure that?
Yeah, sure.
So that I don't know.
No, those are all terrific points. So in terms of what is sustainable investing, right? So sustainable investing is really the term that we've used to encompass investing where investors, instead of saying what investors historically have said, is I should only be concentrating on traditional financials, kind of what's in the balance sheet. That sustainable investing is saying no, you really should also think about what are the environmental issues, the social issues, the good governance issues that may actually impact value. And so strategies that we talk about as sustainable investing strategies are investors who will say, I'm specifically into my investing policy, investment strategy, going to include different factors. And so it might be a specifically climate change oriented investment that is going to only really invest in things that are helpful for climate adaptation or climate mitigation. It might be a social justice focused fund or investment that is looking at promoting affordable housing or access to affordable quality healthcare. So there's what we've seen over the past number of years is this huge proliferation, because to your point, people care about all sorts of different things, right? And people want to invest in different ways. So some investors want to have a climate focused, sort of low carbon impact investment portfolio, potentially because they are very focused on climate change as a personal value, potentially because they want to de-risk their portfolio, right? They may not want to own property that is in locations that are at huge climate risk. And you're right. It's one thing to say 99% of millennials and 85 to 90% of all investors, quote, are interested in sustainable investing. But to your point, everyone is very interested in different things. Some people are very focused on gender. Others are focused on affordable housing. Others might be focused on clean water. And what's interesting now is that you can have more and more choices to be able to say, I specifically want this one that is about biodiversity, or this one that is about affordable housing. And then there are also more sort of broad brush kind of, I'm not going to call them vanilla, but more generalized ones that say this is an ESG fund. You might see that on, some choices. It'll be an ESG fund, which means that they are looking at all the traditional financials, and they're also baking in also environmental and social governance factors, which can cause, two companies might look identical if you look at just the traditional financials. And then when you look at how they're managing carbon or how they're managing diversity, one of them might move up, one of them might move down. So these ESG funds, would be looking potentially at those ones that are faring better on ESG. So it's a very diverse field, but yeah, it's really trying to tailor to people.
And you'll see that the terms get interchanged all the time. So there'll be term ESG, there'll be sustainable investing, there'll be impact investing. So there's lots of terms that get intertwined in many of this, but a lot of it is around how do you not just look at traditional financials, but also incorporate different criteria that might be different for different types of people and what they're specifically interested in. But I will say, for those of you that have not been in investing, or if you have a 401k, this was not a choice 20 years ago. You didn't get to invest your money in a fund that was looking at the environment, or that was looking at women-oriented businesses or anything. You didn't have any of those choices. And the fact that that force has come to ask for that change, I think that is where change is going to happen. And for those of you that have 401ks and other things, think about asking those questions of your investors, because that's when the change starts to happen. It's not just when the investors offer it, it's when those that are investing start asking why there isn't more. Please.
In terms of the ESG investing, are these organizations that are able to offset by buying out with carbon offsets and considering themselves to be a fully carbon neutral organization? Like, where is the standardization or definition for that type of investing?
Yeah. So look, so you've put your finger on what a huge issue right now, which is around this standardization, right? Because I think, and the good news is that we are sort of coming out of the primordial soup phase, right? Where I think there was definitely, as Sonal knows better than anyone, right? There's been this whole set of different terminology and whatnot, and everyone's sort of defining for themselves what they mean. A couple of things I would say. One is at the last climate conference in Glasgow, one of the, I think, most significant announcements, even though it didn't come out of Glasgow, was the agreement to form what's called the IASB, the International Accounting, the International Accounting Sustainability Board standards. And so really looking at an international agreement and kind of consensus around what are the sustainability factors that really matter to business. And to your point, right, like if you're a technology company, whether or not you do animal testing on your products is probably not relevant the way it would be for a consumer goods product. And so it's really about finding industry by industry, company by company, what are the things that actually matter to the business and therefore the impact that you're creating. And so, so your example of, buying carbon credits, right? That would probably really not materially affect your valuation and how an investor and an analyst would look at it. But also to your point, frankly, the more that you as clients, consumers, employees are really holding, people to what does that mean when I see an advertisement saying company X is going to be carbon neutral? How are you doing that? What does that mean? And more importantly, how are you changing your business to do that?
So before I take the next question, Saumya, so this is sort of an interesting question that also comes at how do you look at which legislation and how are you all thinking about what do you pick on, on social justice? Because everything is social justice. And it's sort of the same question as to what you're picking in the C4. Why do you pick certain legislation versus other legislation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think right now we're working through, how we're approaching state legislation, because there really is, as everybody I'm sure knows, bill after bill after bill is filed, and whether or not it sees the light of the day in committee or whether or not it gets a committee vote and sort of how it proceeds is an open question. And so I think when we look at legislation, we definitely want to start by looking at, our motivating sort of mission as a coalition under the banner of social justice, which really comes down to policing, criminal justice, and democracy. And is this legislation have a shot at effectively making some change in one of those three areas? And then I think, once you drill down in there, you can start asking questions about what is the likelihood of passage, what sort of work needs to be done, how do we bring some light to the issue. And I think part of this is also just how we measure success. I think, the NBA is, wins and losses, right? And so there's a lot about making sure you're getting the wins, but a win isn't necessarily just getting legislation over the finish line. I think that's obviously very, very, very important, but even just having the ability and the voice of the players and the coaches to put behind the owners and the teams to put behind certain pieces of legislation, you can get folks who maybe weren't ready to listen about a certain piece of legislation to actually start thinking about why something like that matters, and to potentially start setting up, a multi-cycle understanding of trying to get getting a certain piece of legislation passed. I think this is especially true when you look at, for example, criminal justice, right? The Equal Act is a piece of legislation that we've come out for. We've had Coach Dwayne Casey meet with legislators along with our executive director meet with various folks in DC. And, it now does have that magic number of 60 Senate votes. And hopefully we'll be able to get something scheduled on the Senate calendar soon. But I think looking at it through that lens, and then also seeing what is the impact we can make with our very specific sort of resources as, being a large voice in a room. And then at the state level, it's not just necessarily those three big pillars, but also what do the teams care about, and how can the teams position themselves on things, whether it is affordable housing or environmental impact, especially in different markets where those things matter in different ways, gun violence prevention, and how can we help those teams sort of reach out and understand which legislators to partner with and how best to approach any certain piece of legislation in their state house.
You have a question back?
I have a question. I just want to go back to the investor side, since I'm an investor as well, right? So basically, you have a lot of kind of create new fund, right? Like ESG fund, the Women Leadership Fund. But the point is, this fund needed to be profitable and it needed to be a benefit for the investors, right? So how the investment company can influence the governance to make sure that the legislation and the regulation will be in favor of this type of fund. For example, like, we needed to say the green energy when you want to go to the electronic, car, right? But what is policy can lead towards the people affordable for the electronic car? What are your thoughts about that?
But I'm sorry, so how can we make policies align?
The regulation will be in favor of this type of industry and this type of fund, and
Yeah.
to make this fund is more profitable for the investors.
Yeah, well, I would say two things, and part of it, Sonal, I think that you should jump in on because I know you're playing such a dutiful moderator, but I know you've got like fascinating answers on everything. So I'll start, and then I'm gonna ask you to pick up on the policy piece because I think that's so critical. I mean, what I would say is the products today that are marketed as and offered as investment products, right? So not a deliberately concessionary fund or a quasi-philanthropic fund or thing, but that are investment products. They are really built as, and the firms that offer them, their credibility is on the line, that they are going to be aiming to be as profitable as any other fund and also be integrating these additional factors. And I think what's promising for the investors is that we've really seen that companies and strategies who are thoughtful about sustainability where it really matters to their business are doing actually quite well. And now, just to give you like one quick example, like our equities analysts, in the early days when they started saying, well, what would it do to our valuation recommendations if we were to look at things like diversity, like environmental issues that we traditionally don't? They found some really interesting things. Like one example was actually there was a shoe company, and that traditionally the equity analysts never really bothered focusing on all of the girls' empowerment things that they did in the community, the recycling of old shoes into new shoes, and some of these education programs for the community, because those weren't deemed to be material. Those weren't deemed to be material financial factors. When they actually went back and looked at that, they found that doing those recycled products wasn't just a marketing ploy, it actually reduced their cost of goods sold. That doing the girls' education empowerment actually led them to have more diverse workforce, less churn, fewer HR costs, and more innovation. And so it actually led to an upgrade of the stock. And so a lot of these funds are actually really looking at what are the companies that have shown they understand how this affects their bottom line, their people, their innovation, and productivity. And so that's where it does sort of the stars start to align for investor and community. But you're absolutely right. We absolutely need more policies for things like climate change, right? Yes, there are many climate-friendly investments that are profitable and or more resilient and or better risk management even today. But would there be a much different economic case for it if we had a price on carbon? If we had more state, federal, or international regulations around carbon emissions? Absolutely, right? And so that's why I think, again, this conference is so great, because it absolutely, and my mantra, and I know Sonal's too, having been in the nonprofit and the private and public sectors, is we absolutely need all three of them working together. No one sector alone can do it. And so I think it'd be great if you talk also about, just picking up on Saumya, your comments, that even within just public policy, right? It's getting a piece of legislation passed and getting the appropriations and getting the machinery and the infrastructure to actually implement it so that it hits, the real world. But I know, Sonia, it would be great if you jumped in.
No, I think this is such an interesting conversation because there's so many angles to this. So part of it is, in many cases, businesses are like, we'll do it, government, stay out of our way. In some cases, the businesses are like, hey, government, would you do this? So when I was at Goldman Sachs and we were doing this together, at some point, the businesses were coming back and saying, could you regulate the environmental costs so that it's consistent across states? Because what you're seeing, Saumya, and what you're doing is like you're going state by state asking for legislative change. Eventually, someone's going to be like, hey, we have to have 50 different policies, and I'd rather just have one policy rather than have 50 different ones. And I think so it's a question of how do you want to think about policy? Do you start at the state level and do regulations at the state level and then go to federal? Do you start at the federal, or what you were talking about or do you start at the international and saying we need consistent standards across the board? But you can't, if you just started with consistent standards across the board, people would have said no. You sort of need a little bit of the experimentation to happen to say, what are we trying to actually standardize? And then when is policy the right place? I'll just speak for ourselves. When we were in the Obama administration, we thought about policy in three ways. So one is, how can you, as a government, just bring people together to even have the conversation, that it matters that we are thinking about environmental, social governance criteria. And that in itself got people to start asking, what are they doing in their companies and how are they doing? So Audrey was early on in adopting, but frankly, none of the other banks were. So by bringing that conversation to the table, that began the conversation. Then the second place we started was like saying, okay, well, the government invests. Are we asking these questions even ourselves as to, do our pension investments of the government even take into account ESG criteria? So once the government starts asking that question, then other funds start saying, oh, here's what we're doing and here's why we might do this. Again, no legislative changes have taken place yet. Third, what kinds of businesses are we going to invest in? Do they incorporate ESG conversations? And just by asking them to disclose it in their applications, it's a different conversation. So this was just a place for how policy can play a role. Then there's can we get the legislation done? But the legislation itself is not enough. If it's not funded legislation, then it's just a legislative pass. So yeah, somebody passed it in legislation, but if you didn't fund it, and there's no money in it for agency X or Y or Z to do anything, then the hate crimes bill, right? So there was this hate crimes bill that got passed. Without money against the hate crimes bill, it's just a hate crimes bill. So if the agencies or DOJ doesn't have money to actually enforce it, then there's no money, there's no actual anything that's happening. So we have to make sure when we think about policy, we think about the whole life cycle of where in policy do we want to have the intervention and how do we want to have the intervention. So
yeah,
go ahead.
it reminds me, your question and your comments remind me also of this really interesting conversation. It was I think we were doing a Hill Day with sort of clean tech, related folks and trying to go to different offices. And from the entire day, with way too much talking, there was one comment that stood out to me as the one that landed the most with the policymakers that we talked to, and it was from a private equity investor who said, look, I'm a private equity investor. I have decided that clean energy is the way of the future, and so we have this big fund in it. And I am indifferent to what country those checks land in, but I will tell you that more and more and more of those checks, because of the policy, the state of policy around climate change and carbon, more and more of my checks are going to Europe. I am indifferent to that as an investor, but you as a U.S. regulator, should not be, right? I just think it's, figuring out where your lever of power can really affect, government is critical.
So we have 10 minutes. I want to, before I get to I want to ask sort of this question because we are at the APAICS conference. You are both Asian Americans in two very different industries. And I'd like to know a little bit of what has it been like to be forward thinking in the industry you've been in, Audrey, and I don't think there were that many Asian Americans in government when we were in government. So I just want to say, I think this was so how do you think about sort of where the state of our community is in the industry that you are both in, which is looking at social impact through business? So Saumya, why don't you start?
It's a great question. And, I am very new to my role, 2 months in. But I gotta say, the Asian American community is very important, I think, to sports and to basketball generally. And thinking about this particular intersection of sort of policy and sports, I've been very encouraged about, what I have seen and I've always actually been very encouraged by what I have seen by the AAPI community, and especially the next generation of folks who have come up and blazed some new trails, I think, for folks in terms of ways in which to get involved. The NBA, obviously has like employee resource groups, and they have an AAPI one that's, very active and does important work. But, at the end of the day, again, it goes back, I think, to the mission of the league, which is around basketball and around the community that sport can build. And I think that community is very strong with AAPI folks here in the States. And so understanding how and where and when to reach out to these communities, but also that within the league there is support for social justice, which is something that, affects the AAPI community, as Sonal just cited, the hate crimes bill, affects our community, at such a visceral level, right? To work at a place that has done and will continue to do good work around social justice initiatives, and to help form what that looks like, I think is really important, because we are a part of that conversation, and we should not shy away from being a part of that conversation and understanding, especially, for example, under a pillar of democracy, as AAPI folks become a very important sort of voting bloc around the country, but also specifically in a few different communities, NBA markets included. How do you get the growing suburban AAPI community involved in democracy and voting in Atlanta? And seeing how the Hawks partnered with Fulton County to make their arena a voting site, and to do certain outreach, that is absolutely also about the growing influence of the various suburban communities, their AAPIs included. And I think that's really important and really encouraging.
And I will say what's been encouraging is Joe Tsai, who's the owner of the Brooklyn Nets, has actually taken a lot of leadership in ensuring every time there's been incidents against Asian Americans to make sure his players are going out and filming or putting it out on social media to make sure it's cross-community collaborations, and it's not just Asian Americans, Black Americans, Latino Americans, but it's been actually, he's done a lot in that. So I really appreciate the NBA's leadership in this space. Audrey, you've been in this space for a long time. So where's our community in impact investing, but in finance, and how do we take a bigger leadership role?
Yeah, so I think you put your finger on it with those last couple of words is leadership, right? Where I think we really need to step up, and we need to kind of find our voice, and we need to be willing to be leaders, for our community, in whatever profession or other community that we're in. Because, look, on the one hand, Morgan Stanley has been amazing to me, right on up to, our head of HR, our CEO, James Gorman, of course. And, and the commitment to diversity is real and lasting and genuine and significant. And for the finance industry as a whole, and I think, frankly, for a lot of selective organizations in our society, whether that be selective universities or any sort of competitive workplace that is really focusing on high achieving, highly educated, high achieving, high producing folk, we have to be really upfront about trying to figure out changing the narrative so that we don't have this issue of, the Asians as the model minority, you're well educated, you work hard, you get good grades, and so you'll be a great team member. But as the recent study from, TAF and Status pointed out, that people still have the perceptions, whether it's because of media or whatever, that those model minorities are great as co-workers, as teachers, as doctors, as technical experts, but not as the big guy in the corner office or the big gal in the corner office, right? And I think it's amazing that Joe Bay, now as co-CEO of KKR, he's really the first Asian to get not a C something O title, but CEO, and that's huge. But I think that we really need to do more of that, because I do think that, the combination, as they call it, of the model minority myth with the so-called bamboo ceiling, and I think sometimes our own reticence to sort of step up and say, you know, we're not just Asian in May, we're Asian all year long, at least, and you know, and how do we really advocate for our community and do so in a way that is very much about in solidarity with other communities of color, right? So this is not Asian matters more or differently than other communities. It's that if we are to achieve, you know, a more perfect union, it is about a higher standard of inclusion and belonging for all of us, and that we as Asians, I think, need to. This is our moment to kind of come forward and to be much more outspoken about our allyship and solidarity with other communities of color, and about, you know, none of us get to a more perfect union if we're not all, I think, getting a better sense of belonging.
You had a question back there.
Hi, my name is Juan Palso. I spoke at a panel yesterday on behalf of the CFA Society's Veterans Roundtable, but my day job is at Societe Generale. My cousin's actually at Morgan Stanley, so he wanted me to ask the campaign that's ongoing where we are Morgan Stanley, you know, what inspires you? And so that goes to all three of you speakers. What inspires you?
About just anything.
Especially in this space right now where we're seeing so much discrimination and marginalization.
Yeah, look, I guess what inspires me is frankly, the energy that we've seen from the community, right? And that if we can actually take all the incredible talent and passion and energy and frankly, platforms that we each have, that I think we can make an enormous difference, right? Frankly, my sort of mantra of life is, you know, rather than saying, "Ooh, I wish I had more power, but I don't because I'm not there," right? It's like wherever you are, you have power, right? Like that Archimedes thing. I'm like, you know, just give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I can move the world. Well, we all have a place to stand, right? And we all have a lever, and now is our time to use it.
So.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. You know, I think much like a lot of people in this room and at this conference, I am the child of immigrants. And, you know, my family sort of lived the quote unquote American dream, right? Both parents came here, they worked hard. My dad went to grad school here. He worked as, you know, the security guard at the night shift at a Hartford parking lot. It's not exactly glamorous, but it did what he needed to do to get himself through school. My mom went back to grad school. They were able to put 2 boys through college, and I'm very, very grateful to them for all of their hard work, and I'm very, very grateful to an America that allowed that to happen. But then, you know, I looked around and I saw that a lot of people were working just as hard, doing all of the right things. And a lot of those same immigrant families that looked like mine that came just 10 years later weren't necessarily getting the same results. And I think grounding myself in the people and in the folks, you know, who the injustice really affects, whether it is, you know, the environmental impact or whether or not they get a shot or get a certain job or have, you know, a ceiling put above them for being an immigrant or a child of immigrants or, you know, just not having that opportunity. And thinking about, like, you know, I heard a story the other day about somebody who received a surprise bill for an overnight hospital stay of over $50,000. And like, that is crushing. And it is not, you know, it is not a fair way to organize our work. And so, you know, going back to how do we solve the problems of our democracy and how do we make it so that we can live in a more equal society, I try to ground myself and be motivated by and inspired by the people who live here and who, you know, actually have these policies affect their day-to-day lives, because at the end of the day, we're not just looking, you know, at long policy documents or spreadsheets. These are things that affect people's lives, and I try to remember that, and every once in a while you get the opportunity to. I was at the Innocence Project Gala the other day, and to see, you know, the the National Basketball Coaches Association has a long-standing relationship with the Innocence Project. And at the end of that gala, they had, I want to say 3 dozen, maybe 4 dozen innocent folks who had several thousand years worth of jail time between them come up and stand on the stage. And, that moment was just so impactful. And it's those sorts of moments and those sorts of, those people where, society has so much more to do for. That's what inspires me.
And I'll add my 3 to it. One, I think there's a generation today that is having a conversation that is not a one-time conversation, but it is a constant conversation, whether it's coming from the environment or whether it's coming from social justice in criminal justice or whether it's coming from healthcare. There's a conversation that is consistent. And not only are you all having the conversation, you're putting your money where your mouth is. You're leaving when somebody's not doing it, and you're willing to change it. And that's courage. And that courage did not exist, honestly, in my generation. We were too afraid to make that change or to push those levers or to quit our jobs. And I'm inspired by the generation that is doing that. And I'm grateful for you all for teaching us a little bit about courage. The second thing I'm sort of inspired by, and I think we sometimes forget about, is while we live in Washington, D.C., in the rest of the world, people are doing things. It's happening every single day. My parents live in Houston. I grew up in Houston. I go there every 2 weeks. I stay there. And I live in a community that's Black, that's Latino, that's Asian. And honestly, every single day, those families are getting up and they're making change in their lives and they're working very hard for their families. And they believe that there is an opportunity here, and we have to believe for them that there is an opportunity here. If we get too caught up in the negative and forget that they're here and they're fighting against everything that they have probably lived and had to leave to come, that we have to have belief and to do that. And then finally, I think we have the power. I think Audrey's point is right on. We have the power to make change every single day. The choices we make, the things we buy, where we put our money, where we choose to do something, where we choose to work. There is more power in each of us as individuals than we give credit for. And I think we want the institution to do it all, but we are the institution and we have to believe we are the institution. So I think that's where the hope is, honestly. Please.
First of all, I just want to say thank you to all of you for having this conversation. As a daughter of a Filipino immigrant and Asian American, moved to Asia by choice after high school, during college, I find coming back just a real passion to bridge certain worlds. My background is media and entertainment as a spokesperson for a lot of nonprofits. And during COVID, I was inspired to do more, like many of us and like what you're talking about. I started a nonprofit that I'm now running that our mission is to advance both social and environmental well-being while fostering unity through community love, to empower the community to be part of the solution. While we're a nonprofit, we've had the opportunity to kind of run as a foundation because we have some generous people on our board. So we sponsored the Asian World Film Festival, for example, that supports over 50 countries. That's awesome. So social justice, but through media and storytelling. We partner with the Chopra Foundation on a mental health film, and we also have now a global tree planting forest growing initiative for not just the environmental impact, but for all the social impact that we can have at the same time. We're finding ways to bridge these worlds. So we have partnerships in 19 countries now. We are very mindful of support empowering women, educating children through green school programs. So long list, and by no means my expertise, but with amazing people that we partner with. And so what we're focusing now is how to connect with companies and individuals who want to fulfill CSR and ESG goals. And a lot of it's been through, one-on-one introductions and going through that route. But I was wondering if you have any advice on the best way to connect to people who want to fulfill those goals, so we can have a chance to share an opportunity to have a solution for them or help them fulfill that.
So Audrey, before you answer that, I just want to say, so that is hope, right? That is what's happening. That to me is the hope that we have. That's
totally amazing and really exciting. Look, I think that, probably the real answer is it sounds like you're better at marketing and communication than any of the existing organizations. So probably whatever you're going to do for yourself on social is going to be amazing. But I think to tap into some of the establishment, right? I think among the things I could think about are like BSR, the Business Social Roundtable. They have all the sort of, right, all the execs, and it was a big deal that a couple of years ago that, their CEO signed this letter that said that they believe their company should have purpose. And then of course there was 2 years of navel gazing. What does that mean? And, but I think that BSR is a place where they convene. BSR does a great job of convening CEOs and CSR, heads or the moral equivalent of that. And so that would be a great way to sort of plug into corporate, the corporate halls of power about how you could do it in a more meaningful way. It's a membership organization, a nonprofit, BSR, Business Social Roundtable. But frankly, also, to me, I feel like something like you should be featured on like a stage like Davos, right, where you have all these CEOs thinking about how do I do the right thing, but how do I engage my employees? How do I engage my customers? And to have ways that are social and that are community based and that have the social justice opportunity, I think would be really, attractive to them.
So big groups together that are really.
Yeah, I think some of these.
People who are looking to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and increasingly there are sort of organizations of chief sustainability officers, or chief or things like mission, MIE,
mission-driven investments, places like that. There's also an organization called CECP.
Oh yeah,
corporation. I don't remember. It's a group of people that do social responsibility.
It's
CECP. If you just look it up,
yeah,
it's corporates that do philanthropy and social responsibility. So there's these coalitions where you could probably enter the coalition through having these conversations. But I'll just be honest, part of it is just the hard work of going individual by individual. Somebody on your board knows somebody in a company, go talk to them, and they'll introduce you to a bunch more people. That's largely the best way to do it. You can go to these groups, but sometimes it's just going into a company that can open the door for you to do that, and that'll open up lots more doors.
Or getting an NBA player to
do something with you.
Not just companies, but individuals or like influential artists and talents. Like, how do we is there a place to find out? Just like you said, the NBA maybe has its passion on legislation, but I'm learning more from the individuals. Athletes, for example, may have their own specific causes that they want to support. Is there a place or person to talk to find that out?
Let's take that off. I would love for you to have that conversation. Can we just take that off because I don't know if you wrap. Wait, one more comment. Did you want to make a comment or did you have a question?
Oh, I had a question. I think I could.
Okay, let's do it afterwards. So first of all, I just want to say thank you all for coming to this conversation. I think, if anything, take away from this that there are so many ways to think about how business can engage in doing good in communities. It may not look exactly the same for every business or in every way, but ask the next level question. Are they doing what you want them to do? They can't solve every problem because it's not business's job to solve every problem, but through the business and the way they operate, are they doing something that you care about, and does that make a difference to you? Similarly, there are organizations like the NBA, which nobody would have thought about, would have created a C4 to do social justice, even though they have been doing it in their individual ways. To recognize that collectively we can do something more than individually is actually a super important point. And I think that's where the world is going. So hopefully you all will engage in your own ways, but also as Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, ANHPI communities, we have a role to play. We can collectively bring our power, our collective choices to influence the change we want in our companies or in our organizations. And I hope we all take some of that because I think it's an opportunity for us. And this is our moment and our time. And I hope we take advantage of that. So thank you all for coming to this. Thank you for APAICS for hosting this. This was fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
to our speakers.
Thank you.